so next up is going to be 1/4 inch piecing, or piecing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it might be interesting for you to know that quilters often say that we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but really we mean a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, which means slightly narrower than a 1/4 of an inch. And the reason for that is to take up for the fold of the fabric. So when you've got a pieced block or a pieced strip of fabric, each time that you open these seam allowances or press these seam allowances, there's a little bit of take up of the measurement, so a couple of thread widths. It doesn't mean very much, but overall, you know, over the course of a whole quilt, say 48 different seams, you're looking at about a 1/2 inch difference. So you want to be as accurate as possible. So lots of tools to help you do that. First of all, the presser foot, of course, is the most important. This particular presser foot is for a Bernina machine, and you'll see that it has these little notches on the foot. The needle obviously goes right down there in the center, and so that little notch lines up directly with the needle. The one above it is exactly a 1/4 of an inch away from the needle, and the one behind 1/4 of an inch behind the needle. And of course, the edge of the foot is also a 1/4 of an inch from the needle, as long as the needle is in the center position. So what you want to do is test your own presser foot. There's lots of different feet on the market. Another common one is one that's got a bit of a fence to it. It's got a metal piece along the edge where you have the opportunity to push the fabric up against that fence so that it doesn't creep out underneath. The drawback with that is oftentimes people will push a little bit too hard, creating a bit of a bulge here, which is actually a wider than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So you want to be really careful about that. When we get to the machine, I will show you just exactly how you organize this so that it is a perfect scant 1/4 inch. Your sewing machine needle is also important, and as my father says, there is a tool for every construction method, and in this case we're going to be using the proper needle. When you're using cotton fabric, you'll want a sharp needle, so that is either a Microtech Sharp, or I actually prefer a top stitching needle. This particular one is done by Superior, and it is titanium coated, which is very nice. It you know, it glides through the fabrics very nicely. I use a size 70, a 70-10. You could also use an embroidery needle. An embroidery needle has a nice sharp point and a suitable eye for about a 50 weight thread. When we get to quilting, the actual sewing of the 3 layers together, the backing, batting, and quilt top, we'll be talking about quilting needles. But these are the most common ones, and the best quality that you can afford is always best. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about thread because that's a whole other lecture altogether. But good quality long staple Egyptian cotton is what you're after for piecing. This particular brand is Aurifil, and it is one of the very best brands. It's got the least amount of lint, in my opinion, and comes in lots of great colors. It's very, very good quality. So Aurifil 50 weight thread is what I would recommend for piecing. So we're going to do a test sample, and I would recommend that you do this test sample on every machine that you have, not just the brand of machine, but even the type of machine. So if you get a new or an upgraded Bernina or an upgraded Janome or an upgraded Pfaff, a different machine for you, be sure to do your seam allowance check. Every time you change your presser foot too, you're going to do your seam allowance check. Once you do this for your machine, you don't ever have to do it again. You'll have all the features, all the controls dialed in. So we're going to start with 3 strips of fabric. These strips of fabric are cut at 1.5 inches each. So each are 1.5 inches wide, and we're going to sew them together. So 2 seams, 2 1/4 inch seam allowances. We're going to end up with a 3.5 inch wide strip. And that's the test. Once you sew these together and press the seam allowances correctly, it should line up so that you've got exactly 3.5 inch wide. If you don't, you have to adjust your seam allowance accordingly. And there's lots of little tricks that you can do to easily manipulate your particular machine so that it will give you the proper scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so we're gonna talk about a 1/4 inch seam allowance now and the proper way to do that. This, of course, is a Bernina sewing machine, so this is the 1/4 inch presser foot for a Bernina machine, and you can see that it's got these notches, as I mentioned before. This notch in the center here is directly in line with the needle. The notch behind is a 1/4 of an inch behind that, and the notch in front is a 1/4 of an inch in front of the needle. The edge of the foot, both sides, is exactly a 1/4 of an inch as long as your needle is in the center position. This particular model of Bernina has 11 different needle positions, so I can move that needle over and over and over as little or as much as I need to. To find out how accurate your 1/4 inch seam allowance is, or foot, or even your needle position, what you're going to want to do is take your OmniGrid ruler, again, that very accurate ruler, put your presser foot down so that it's lined up with the edge of the ruler, and now just very gently engage your needle so that it comes down, not through the ruler, of course, but just so that it comes down and you can see exactly where it's falling. Of course, we want this to be a scant 1/4 of an inch. So if your needle comes down directly on this 1/4 inch line, you've got too wide of a seam allowance. You've got a true 1/4 of an inch. What you want is a scant 1/4 of an inch. So in my particular case, I know that I just need to move my needle position over one spot, and that will give me just the little bit of scant 1/4 inch that I'm looking for. Works out every time. I've been doing this a long time. Okay, so now it's time to stitch our 1/4 inch seam allowance. My pieces of fabric are raw edges together. I have my needle down engaged. This particular model has a needle down position, which is very handy. I'm going to position my fingers here so that I hold my fabric, and away I go. So I'm being careful not to get the fabric on the outside of this foot, and I'm also watching that little line right there. If that little line is easier for you to watch than the side of your foot, you may want to put a little piece of tape in place here just to extend that line. Of course, putting it straight would be nice. There, and then I've got a longer line to line up my fabric with. Making sure that it's raw edges together stay together. And there we are. And now I'm ready to do some pressing. Press that seam allowance all in one direction to the dark side of the fabric. And the big test will be to measure from this raw edge to this raw edge. And I'm hoping for 3.5 inches when I sew 3 1.5 inch strips together. I'm going to lose a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch there. So altogether it's going to be 3.5 inches wide. All right, so now we're ready to press our last strip open so that we can measure this strip set here. So I'm pressing to set my seam, and then I'm going to open my fabric and press into that seam line there. And hopefully it will be nice and flat. I don't have any pressing pleats there. And now for the big drum roll, we're going to measure this and see if we are 3.5 inches. And that looks pretty darn close to me. 3.5 inches. And that's the test that you need to do. Once you do that test and you have adjusted your seam allowance, whether that means moving your needle over one position or moving your fabric in from the edge of the foot ever so slightly, that will give you the perfect scant 1/4 inch, and you won't ever have to do this test again.